Gender, the mystical yet elusive concept with so many definitions that in reality it means nothing. If you went to Arkansas and inquired about the long-lost meaning of gender, you would leave with the understanding that there are only two of them, male and female. You can't change your gender, and your gender is the exact same thing as your sex. Now, if you ventured on over to Seattle, you would be led to believe that gender is in fact not fixed and is actually fluid or even infinite. Gender is completely separate from sex and is based more on your personality and social behavior. So this leads us to the natural question. What is gender? A question pondered by many, answered by many, and understood by none. According to the Oxford Dictionary, gender is the male sex or the female sex, especially when considered with reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones, or one of a range of other identities that do not correspond to established ideas of male and female. Which sounds like they took the original definition and just added a shitty little disclaimer that discredits the previous sentence just to appease the masses. Greetings, boys and girls and others. I am the Misogydaddy, and today we will be trekking through one of the most dangerous places known to mankind, my mind. I woke up today with the tingling sensation in my loins to piss off as much of the interweb as humanly possible, and so today we will be exploring the depths of the gender debate and dissecting what the fuck gender actually is and what it means in our modern society.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
Before we can ask what is gender, we first have to understand why is gender. If gender is the social manifestation of the two sexes, why did society at some point in history deem it necessary to make this distinction? As a certified gender studies PhD, I feel there is no one better than myself to educate you all on this topic. Please note that my ideas are better than most people's and should be regarded in the same validity as esteemed scientists, ancient philosophers, or God. And if you think about it for more than 3 seconds, it's really quite simple to figure out why we need gender. Gender is simply a proxy for your individual sex, meaning that your gender is supposed to be a quick and easy method to identify your sex. Gender is simply a way of communicating what lies between your legs using social cues so you don't actually have to spread them. And this makes perfect sense because depending on who you ask, it isn't quite ideal to have everyone walking around naked all the time, especially if you're less than attractive. And because we as humans are very, very interested in determining the sex of individuals we interact with for friendships, relationships, medical, and other purposes, we need a less invasive way of transmitting this information to others. Introducing gender, and more specifically gender roles, was the perfect proxy to mediate and facilitate interpersonal interactions among individuals. And for the more cynical among us, a perfect weapon to manipulate and control every individual's behavior. Ultimately, the main purpose of gender was as a mechanism to fast-track the sexual and dating market. By defining clear and distinct gender roles, it becomes simple to identify who has a peen and who has a vagine. It creates a structure that outlines a clear attractiveness hierarchy, which is also an extremely effective method for social control. The closer you resemble the corresponding gender norm, the more attractive you're going to be. Because everybody, from the Yas Queens to the Gym Bros who claim to work out for themselves, desire to be seen as attractive by their peers and potential partners, the governing powers that be designating specific behaviors that members of each sex should aspire to if they desire to be seen as attractive, makes for an insanely effective method of controlling individuals and their behavior for whatever purposes those in power desire. However, I digress. It is probably more likely that based on the needs of prior civilizations and the way society evolved, that these gender roles manifested as they were more efficient for civilizations of old, especially considering every single significant society in the history of humanity has developed very, very similar gender roles. I am excluding the 3 African tribes people like to bring up all the time who had matriarchs because firstly, I don't deem these tribes as successful civilizations, and also the exception doesn't make or disprove the rule. Gender roles and ideals will likely continue to evolve as society progresses, and that could be part of what we are seeing now as our society's values are shifting faster than ever, likely because information is being transmitted and received faster than ever. It's insanely important I reiterate the core purpose and function of gender to you, so everything I say from here on out can make sense. Gender was a proxy intended to simply and safely communicate your position of either a V or a D. Gender is a reflection of your sex, and they must be aligned. Without the corresponding sex underlying the gender, the system doesn't work.
You need to settle down and mind your business, okay? Ma'am, once
Now let me
again,
just
ma'am.
begin by saying, I don't believe in finding statistics because it's quite tiresome and I really don't care, so I won't. Just take my word as if it were God's, or Allah's, or Einstein's, or Andrew Tate, or whoever you look up to. I would say starting in like the 1960s or something, or whenever the birth control pill was invented, and the single worst event in human history occurred, the sexual liberation of women, is when society really began to question gender and gender roles publicly. Compiling on the realization post-World War II that women could actually work real jobs while men were at war brought questions as to whether stereotypical gender roles were absolute. Now we had a society that freed women of the chains of certain pregnancy and where women knew they were capable of working just the same as men. So 50 years of protests and rallies ensue, and we end up in the 2010s. We are not only calling for the abolition of gender roles, but we have also started pushing for trans inclusivity and introduced the idea of non-binary individuals. I do believe that the abolition of gender roles could pose some benefits, as these gender roles do have some destructive impacts and pressures on many people. An example of this could be toxic masculinity. Not the Gillette kind, but the beat your wife every evening after a hard day at the factory and she didn't make your favorite meal kind of toxic masculinity. However, as I will discuss later, I do think that abolishing gender roles would have more cons than pros. Over the past decade, these pushes for the neutralization of gender roles have become more and more effective, to the point that now here in 2022, or 2023 I should say, transgender and non-binary individuals are pretty universally accepted, at least in public. And most people are shamed for being transphobic if they are intolerant of these individuals or question anything about the ideology.
No, you said sir. Once again, it's ma'am.
I actually said
So
both of you
what
guys.
is gender now? As stated all the way back in the beginning of this video, we understand gender currently as the social attributes associated with each sex, as well as some identities that don't correspond to the typical idea of male and female. We acknowledge that certain individuals have serious troubles identifying with the gender they were assigned at birth and are accepting of them switching not only their gender, but their sex to that of the other cisgender. We are also accepting and supportive of individuals who don't feel like they fit within the confines of male and female and would feel more comfortable identifying as another gender. What I find truly fascinating about the current state of gender is that the order of operations I told you to remember way back at the beginning of the video has been flipped on its head. That where gender used to be the social manifestation of your sex, sex is now the physical manifestation of your gender. Prior to like 2016 maybe, you had your sex and your sex would dictate how society expects you to act. Nowadays, you choose how you want to act and then change your sex after to align with your social behaviors and self-perception. The above only applies, of course, to cisgenders. For the infinite spectrum of non-binary genders, I don't believe these genders actually affect sex whatsoever, and are purely a reflection of these individuals' social behaviors, irrespective of sex. And so this radical acceptance of trans and non-binary individuals has been a long time coming, and I think most of us would agree that it's really a step forward, right? Well, not so fast.
Right beforehand, you fucking said sir.
Sir? Okay.
I believe
Motherfucker.
the way we define gender in our current society is destructive, deceptive, and potentially dangerous. Firstly, let's acknowledge the massive elephant in the room. Gender is inherently sexist. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Gender does designate social differences between the sexes, and gender roles ensure that each sex upholds these behaviors to align with the assumptions about your sex that the other sex deems as attractive. Now, what's truly baffling is the adoption of the transgender movement by the political left. To say that you feel your social behaviors don't resemble that of your current gender and sex, and now that you feel the need to change your gender and ultimately your sex so that it aligns with your new gender, is insanely sexist. You are explicitly acknowledging and conforming to the gender roles prescribed by society, and therefore give those distinctions between the sexes merit and control over your happiness and ultimately your life. This would be completely fine to believe if being a trans ally wasn't associated with the left wing of the political spectrum that also preaches feminism, which largely pushes for the abolition of gender roles and pushes for equality between the sexes. So it truly perplexes me as to how trans individuals could be supported by the left wing, which simultaneously also supports feminism. However, I am aware there is a small, tiny subsection of the feminist movement known as TERFs who do fight against trans acceptance, as they also acknowledge the ideology stems from clinging and conforming to those harmful gender roles. The only way the transgender movement isn't sexist or conformist is if they believe that gender can vary independently and arbitrarily. This means that gender is simply an identity that can be assumed by anyone and for any reason. And I personally believe that this is actually more so how gender operates today, rather than by the fixed categories discussed previously.
Take it outside! If you want to call me sir again, I will show you a fucking sir!
And I am the most assertive, aggressive, and emotionally stunted woman you have ever seen, but I retain my assigned identity of female. I have a friend named Tiffany, but Tiff is soft-spoken, delicate, passive, submissive, makes sandwiches, etc. But she is actually trans and identifies as a man. Our modern society would not only tolerate but accept and protect this behavior. I find this fascinating for a couple of reasons. The first being that most trans individuals have such an acute desire, sometimes mental health issues as a result of their gender dysphoria. Yet in order to alleviate this dysphoria, they first reduce gender, the basis of their crisis, to a simple title that can be changed at will without any categorical measurements or requirements. This is the literal equivalent to changing your name. Somebody please tell me how in the fuck changing your name is supposed to be the cure for a mental health disorder that causes tons of self-deletions every single year. Changing your name or taking hormones to change your voice does not change your clearly identifiable and recognizable bone structure or figure. You will most likely never be able to be identified by others fully as the opposite gender, and I believe trans people know this, and that's why the depression persists post-surgery or post-transition. The second issue being that this reduction of gender to just a title similar to one's name is completely arbitrary and baseless. How can you have an individual who perfectly aligns with the gender norms designated by society for their corresponding sex arbitrarily reject their gender and identify as something completely different? Especially because some transgender individuals don't even change their sex, which is a complete separation of gender from sex, which, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, makes the entire system of gender useless. But let's not pretend that our previous definition of gender outlined above also isn't a little arbitrary. Originally, we defined gender as the social manifestation of the two sexes in social interactions. So this means that your sex determines your gender. Yet we tend to ignore the situation of feminine boys or masculine girls. Is their gender still aligned with their biological sex, or is their gender different because their social conduct may lend itself towards the gender of the opposite sex? And so by the same standards that we deem New Age gender definitions as arbitrary because they can be changed at will and by no universal metric, in a way, the traditional definition is arbitrary in that gender can't be changed regardless of the misalignment between the individual's social behaviors and their corresponding sex. However, I personally still tend to side with the traditional definition of gender because I don't actually believe the original definition is truly arbitrary. Of course, we arbitrarily decide that gender is based on sex, but that has always been the definition of gender, and by that logic, any definition of anything is arbitrary. The basis of gender, being sex, provides a concrete metric we can use to determine the gender of the individual, I think the terms gender, gender role, and gender ideal are often confused. Gender is simply for the purposes of determining your sex using social cues and attributes. You don't have to perfectly align with the gender ideal to be a member of that gender. For the most part, your build is evidence enough of your gender, as how you look is a massive part of how you are perceived socially, and is almost more important than your personality and whether it swings masculine or feminine. This is why when certain individuals who identify as trans don't look like the gender they claim to be based on their build alone, it causes confusion and backlash from the general public. People tend to dislike when they feel like they're being lied to or tricked, especially when it comes to issues affecting their sexual prosperity. This is the same reason a lot of people are disgusted by the manosphere and red pill movement, not necessarily because what they are saying is inherently deceptive or wrong, but because individuals who typically wouldn't exhibit the traits deemed as attractive are now being taught how, which creates a feeling of sliminess and trickery to those seeking naturally attractive men. And this is ultimately the fatal flaw of the modern definition of gender, and why when trans or non-binary individuals claim that their personal choice doesn't hurt anyone, this is actually slightly disingenuous and can be pretty dangerous on a societal scale if this rhetoric is accepted in the name of tolerance. Gender is very similar to accounting in that it's only valuable so long as it's trusted. If the public cannot trust the accounting presented by publicly traded companies, that information is effectively useless. Without valid financials backing the company, what are you actually investing in? This translates perfectly to the concept of gender, because if the definition of what determines gender is constantly changing, and people can no longer trust the stated gender of an individual to actually indicate their corresponding sex, you can't trust the system, and the system renders itself useless. Without gender, the dating markets would become even more inefficient, because we would have to exert extra effort in determining the sex and the desirable qualities any prospects possess. Interestingly, the modern push for transgenderism actually undermines itself because A, nobody genuinely believes your stated gender is your true gender at their core, because you don't actually fit the social expectation of what somebody of that gender would actually look like. And B, if they did believe you looked in line with the gender you were presenting as, it would create a greater distrust for the gender system in the first place and discredit the system and your trans identity as a whole. Now, if you thought my issues with the gender debate ended with trannies, oh boy, are you wrong. This is just the beginning.
Motherfucker!
I apologize now.
I present to you my further disapproval of the modern definition of gender, as well as my disapproval of the gender is a spectrum, fluid, or infinite movement. TLDR, gender being fluid makes absolutely no fucking sense. The only way this argument makes any sense whatsoever is if you believe there are real criteria for gender which can be assigned to different individuals along the spectrum systematically. However, that's not how this works. We all know that presenting someone with their actual reality is considered oppressive. The only way gender can be fluid and infinite is if we reject the rigidity that basing gender off of two biological sexes presents. Which, for the purposes of this segment of the video, fine, I'll do it. So, gender is now defined purely as the social presentation and behavior an individual exhibits in social situations. Even if this is true, because we don't want to assign gender, and gender varies independently of any metric or criteria, it has no meaning. Gender is reduced to a preference, a fashion, a style, if you will. But even styles have certain criteria you have to meet to be classified under that style. And this isn't where it ends, because gender is also a reflection of your social interactions and behavior, which involves social skills, personality, and your experiences. This now subcategorizes gender into an infinite extent, as everybody's personality and life experiences are different and can't really be categorized or grouped together. And so if this is how we want to redefine gender, it is important to acknowledge that gender must be infinite in this situation. And if gender is infinite and unique to every individual, it has no real meaning or significance. It is equivalent in meaning to your name. But that's why you have a name in the first place. Under this definition, your gender is now a reflection of your looks, personality, and experiences. Gender encapsulates every aspect of your being, but that is just your personal identity. Your name already represents that. When people picture the Misogidaddy, they picture someone who is well-dressed, hilarious, super hot, respectable, intelligent, caring, kind, popular, rich, charismatic, humble, the list goes on. That is my personal identity, not my gender identity. And that is why I refuse to give the gender is fluid or non-binary movement any merit, because it conflates gender identity with personal identity.
I need your corporate number, because I'm going to call them and talk about how I was misgendered several times in the store.
Last one, with the modern understanding of gender, is the redefinition of gender norms or ideals. I believe this is a movement with honestly the best of intentions, as generalizing an entire demographic and prescribing certain behavior can obviously be very harmful and negatively impact a lot of people's self-image. Individuals who don't align with the beauty standards, gender norms, and gender ideals imposed on them by society are subject to ridicule, shame, and insecurity. So it's completely understandable how these individuals who are shat on by the system would want to change it to be more accepting. However, let's say we abolish gender roles and ideals. Gender is now the exact same thing as sex, and there is no social pressure or expectation of the sexes whatsoever. This video hasn't already ruffled your feathers. This idea is going to set you off the deep end. I believe true freedom is the demise of any great society. I believe if you could trace the downfall of every prominent society in the history of humanity to one thing, it would be freedom. If you guys think that's an interesting topic and want to see another video about freedom being the demise of a society, make sure to let me know about that down in the comments. Because ultimately, freeing individuals from the chains of the gender norms imposed on them by society would create the most chaotic, violent, and depressing society we have ever seen. As much as we like to preach about how much we value our freedom, we truly enjoy being dominated by Big Daddy Jeffrey or Stepdaddy Elon. We as humans love being told exactly what to do and what to aspire to. This is why most people work 9 to 5s, go to school, watch the same TV shows, get married around 30, have kids 3 years later, have the same opinions, and lie about doggy style being their favorite position, etc., etc. Humans love pattern, routine, plans, and order. By releasing the reins and letting us run free to conduct ourselves however we want, will undoubtedly cause 3 distinct segments of the human population to simultaneously form. A very tiny portion of the population who are very self-driven and disciplined will prosper and achieve their wildest dreams and live a truly fulfilling life far better than what would have been available to them under the guidance of gender. Another decently sized subsection of the population will be completely lost and directionless and be left with no real guidance in how to support themselves financially, make friends, and find meaningful romantic relationships. They will plummet into deep, deep depressions and ultimately live a life far worse than what would have otherwise been available to them. These individuals will suffer as a result of the lack of order to subscribe to with the abolition of gender roles. And finally, the vast majority of the population would likely adopt a new set of guidelines and rules to provide them with meaning and purpose. It may not be on the basis of gender or sex, but it may be race, religion, culture, or some other demographic factor. These individuals will create a new system that prescribes new generalized rules to the public, which will likely oppress its fair share of people, and the process will repeat itself perpetually. The confusion and chaos that would result from the abolition of gender norms would cause far more harm than good. And this isn't to say that we can't tweak gender norms to be more beneficial for the goals of our modern society, but forcing drastic and extreme changes will cause a lot of harm to a lot of people, and similar to the criticism of the gender fluidity argument, fill the system with distrust and deplete its integrity. There's a concept we discussed in one of my economic classes called perfect information. It is essentially the assumption that everybody in an economic market operates and makes decisions on the same information. If a member of the market doesn't have perfect information, the market operates inefficiently and creates a deadweight loss. If everyone in the dating market is operating on different definitions of gender, unsure of what constitutes a specific gender, and is unsure of what a specific gender represents, the market becomes extremely inefficient because people will not be willing to invest as much effort into these risky assets. I have no way of telling if you're a good partner because I have no proper metric of assessing what you bring to the table. So I would be unwilling to commit to you long term and instead opt for a more short-term relationship to reduce my investment and mitigate risk. I'll make a video exploring perfect information and the dating market at some point in the future, but I think the concept ties in quite nicely. Bringing this dwindling string of ideas to a close, gender is a confusing son of a bitch that really doesn't have to be. Of course, there are some small minorities we have to tolerate and accept, but these exceptions don't make the rule. And I don't think it's necessary for society to have to redefine the definition of gender to accommodate these individuals. The word tolerance literally implies that we are just allowing the unusual behavior to exist, but don't necessarily agree with, promote, or support it. At the end of the day, the aim is to help and assist the individuals who struggle coming to terms with their gender identity. And I truly believe that instead of conforming to their convoluted perception of gender, actually educating these individuals in regards to what gender actually is, the purpose it serves, and why it's okay if you don't fit the gender ideals or gender roles of your corresponding sex would be far more beneficial for their future mental health and ability to cope with reality. Rather than pushing hormones and plastic surgery to little kids simply because it's profitable, we should be investing in education and therapy for individuals with gender dysphoria. Far too often in society do we push a treatment rather than a cure. We tend to focus on the symptoms rather than the cause, and I believe that's exactly what we are doing with gender dysphoria and non-cisgendered individuals. Depression continues to persist post-transition, and all you have done is given into their perception of gender and unleashed the floodgates of cosmetic surgery, which we all know doesn't lead to anything productive. It may take longer and may be more difficult, but we really need to emphasize to disaffected individuals that gender and gender roles are not the end-all be-all, and it is not meant to define you as a person. It is simply a method to identify your sex based on social cues. And so that pretty much sums up my thoughts regarding the gender debate. If you have any agreements, disagreements, extrapolations, mean comments, nice comments, or random facts you want to share with me, let me know in the comments, as I'm sure you've already done. I do really value your opinions because even though I know I'm right, I have no allegiance to my ideas. I don't see the value in holding or promoting bad ideas, and I'm sure you all have something unique to provide to the debate. This channel is all about promoting new ways of thinking about oversaturated political, social, and cultural topics. I'm using this channel almost as a video diary of all my ideas because when you start writing your ideas out and saying them out loud, you really start seeing how stupid some of your ideas are. Hopefully, I open your mind to some new ideas in this video, and if I did, please beat the living shit out of the like button and share it with your friends, as I'm sure it would make for an interesting discussion and would bring some value to their lives as well. If y'all could blow this shit up so that even if I try and weasel my way into the rat race, my future employer sees it and is forced to reject me, I'd really appreciate it. I'll see you girl bosses in the next one. Love you, bye.